Yo, what's up, man?
Yo, what's up, Abhinav? How's it going, man?
Good, dude, good. Middle of a very interesting week for me. Yeah.
Nice. How come? What made it so interesting, man?
So, in terms of the cohort,
Yeah.
one second, bro. Before I get into this, let me make sure because we have. It seems like we might have two streams on our channel. So let me just delete the other one. Yeah, but anyway, so this week has been very interesting because it's the halfway point for the cohort, and what that means is that this is sort of a time for reflection for a lot of people who are part of it. But besides that, this is also when we started our daily design office hours. So, for folks that don't know this, we are now doing one session almost every single day for people who are part of the cohort. And the way we're doing this is we've got a bunch of mentors on board. We've got an entire calendar we made for the next couple of weeks. So there's a bunch of scheduling for that. But in addition, there's some stuff that I'm experimenting with, which is there's a bunch. I mean, I'll talk about this properly later, but there's some parts of my life that I'm now automating. So I'm getting somebody on board to do a lot of the stuff that I was earlier spending a lot of time on. So it's basically growing the team. That's what's been interesting.
Nice. Yeah, we've been discussing a lot about this a lot in terms of building systems and learning. And one of your
Mm.
interviews as well, I think with Vinamra, where you were mentioning that you're taking up programs, cohort-based programs, um, to be able to see big or how bigger cohorts, that is cohorts with 1,000 folks, are managed, such that you can scale the 10K designers cohort itself as well, right?
True,
So
true.
yeah,
What has also been interesting for me is this is this is the second cohort, and it's interesting because the way it started off was me as a creator, but then the where we are right now, where it's the second cohort and the third one is coming up, we have multiple cohorts that are going to come up, which is going to be beyond just learning design, beyond just learning design for beginners. It's requiring me to now step from a creator role to more of a CEO role, where there's a bunch of things that a lot of things that I do, which is like these are tasks that I am responsible for, but it's just not responsible for me to do those tasks anymore
yeah,
because really it's like if I do that, there's a bunch of other things that I don't get to do. So it's almost like I have to now step into this. I don't know. I want to call it the CEO role, but more than that, it's about I have to figure out how to spend my time towards more high leverage activities. And it's not like I'm realizing this now. It's just that now is a time when there's a bit of transition happening. So for me, it's been a lot of um, figuring out mostly by conversations with other CEOs, which is how exactly have you set up your um, rituals, which is what are the different tasks that can be delegated, what are the weekly rituals that need to happen, what kind of meetings should you have, when do you do your review of how your company is running. So that's been cool.
man, this is like some next level stuff. So excited to hear about this though, because this is something which you don't think about a lot. Because what happens a lot, which I feel is you might be going through currently as well, is that you're so focused on creating the company that you're doing so much of hands-on work as well, and that you don't realize that when you need to take a step back, let that work be taken up by someone else, such that you can move on
Mhm.
the higher level stuff.
True. I think it's also interesting because when you're starting out, you do need to do most of the stuff hands on by yourself.
Yeah,
But then after you've reached a point where you're doing the same thing for the second time, and in the foreseeable future, you have to do the same thing for the third time. At this point, you have to bring in processes, which is one second, let me just go to Instagram, which is even when you're let's say a design head. Now, these are some of the kind of conversations we're having or will have in our leadership cohort that we're experimenting with right now. Even when you're a design head, a lot of times it's actually faster for you to do the work yourself. But then if you do the work yourself, then the people who you have on your team, they might not get that opportunity to learn, which is, even if some things take longer, it's better for you to invest in your team to be able to coach them to do it. And what this just means is setting up these kind of processes. So I have done this before, but now it's just trying to repeat that same thing, but for a different set of conditions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for all those who don't know, the design leadership cohort is one of the cohorts that is being experimented as well. That which Abhinav mentioned, that we're not just focusing on design cohorts for beginners to learn design, but also cohorts other than design as well, right? One of them being the leadership cohort. And so which also brings to the which also brings us to the topic that, man, the creativity is happening in so many different ways, right? Like from being a designer and moving to screens to literally designing a company, and kind of focusing on the processes, and also the kinds of, in our case, the kinds of, in your case, the kinds of cohorts as well, right? Like
Mm.
design cohort is not the only cohort that you're experimenting with, and so on and so forth.
True, true. Yeah. So I think today, what we're going to do, people joining in, we're going to be talking about the concept of creativity. We're going to try coming back to that concept. And other than that, we might open a little bit Q&A. But today's session is going to be a little shorter, a little bit more focused, because we want to keep this more Q&A. So if you guys don't have questions, we're going to be ending this one a little earlier. But let's try to do that. Let's try to do as many questions. What we can also do is, since this session is one of the design office hours for the cohort members who are watching right now, we can also do a little bit of feedback. So if there's something you want design feedback on, we can totally do that. Mayank, I want to ask you this one question. So to dive into this idea of creativity,
Yeah.
when did you first realize creativity was a concept? Which is like, how does it coincide with when you started learning, or maybe before that? Or how is your idea of creativity changed over time?
So I feel creativity started, or like I realized that there are things that creativity as a concept exists once I realized that I can add my own version to something, right? Like whenever I'm creating something or learning something or anything that I'm doing, if I'm doing it a bit different from what everyone else around me is doing, or if I'm kind of adding my own thought process or my own personality to it, or in some sense, I would call that as being creative. So that's when it came to me that, okay, now this is me being creative, and if I'm not adding anything from my own side or from my own judgment, or any, if I'm not adding my taste to it, basically I'm just following an orthodox method. Iterating an orthodox method is me being creative. That's how I got introduced or understood as the concept of creativity.
Interesting. And when do you think you first, what's the first memory you have of creating something and actually people using it, and you're like, oh shit, this is kind of fun actually?
Oh, actually, bro, websites. For me, it was websites. Yeah. Like creating websites for a fest, and or for our student clubs and all of that. Like whenever we discussed that we need to make a website, and I had certain choices or decisions in my or things in mind that I really want to do this, or things to be working this way. That's when I felt like, man, I'm actually using my creativity. Like in terms of my creativity being used by other people. Otherwise, there are so many instances where I felt like I'm being creative, or could sometimes like could consider it from the days of art class when I was a kid, to the point whenever I felt like, oh, I did some hack, or like I got my way done in some kind of a sneaky way or kind of pulled off a trick. I was like, oh shit, that was creative. I managed to pull it off. But
Mm.
the first time I used my creativity, which was used by other folks, was I feel websites did that for me.
Mm. I want to ask people in the chat as well. When you think of this concept of creativity, what really comes to your mind? The reason I want to ask this is because I want to try diving a little deeper into creativity as a concept, mostly because I think a lot of people who are getting into design have a certain idea of creativity, and people who are already into design have a certain different idea there. And what usually happens is there is usually a mismatch, which is you can't 100% apply your creativity to UI UX design the same way that you would apply it to art, right? So there is a different types of creativity. But I want to see some comments around this. In fact, I think one of the next, I think either the immediate next video or one of the next videos on my YouTube channel is going to be around creativity. So this is sort of like my way to do a little bit of research and test some of these ideas before making like a full video on it. So here's one way I think about it, which is in college, it was kind of rare for people, for the classes, for them to teach you something new, saying that this is a thing you have to build. Usually it was building based on a certain formula that they gave you, which is you have to do exactly this, like let's say in the lab, and then you have to basically follow that blueprint and make that thing. It was kind of rare in college for them to give out a thing which is like, you have to do something totally up to you, how you decide. But the few points at which that happened, it got very interesting. Like a lot of final kind of projects for a lot of courses, they were like, yeah, you can choose a topic. And that was when a lot of people actually did something which was outside the mold. The idea of there existing a mold and people trying something outside of it. So that was when I first sort of thought about, and that was maybe the time when I was designing a little bit as well. Like I knew just the basics of Photoshop. And for me, it was about, if I learned Photoshop, like Photoshop for me was when I started doing a little bit of this, which is I can actually make something that other people can use. And that was till then something which was very, very rare, had happened hardly in my life, which is most of the things that we use, most of the things around us have been made by other people. And it's very rare for you to make your own things, right? Which is t-shirts, for example, the one you're wearing. This is a t-shirt we've made, right? But think about how rare that is. Most people use things that have been made by other people. And in your life, there's very few things that you made yourself for yourself to use. So for me, that started off the concepts and thoughts around creativity, which is all of these things that other people have made. What are some things that I can make? Firstly, for myself, and then things that I make that other people can use.
Man, I never thought of the first thing for myself. I always felt like, oh, this is something cool, which seems like it would make an impact. For me, it always felt like doing something which made an impact, right? Later on, I would tweak things and add my own touch to it and make it feel like, that it is for myself as well. But the first thing which always felt like, man, the impact it will create, or the ease or clarity that it will bring in whatever thing it was being used towards.
Give me 1 second. I'm just posting a message on our Discord. There's like 10 people in a voice chat right now. I'm like, guys,
nice.
Can you join the Whiteboard live session?
I'm seeing a lot of answers towards what creativity is to you folks. Keep dropping
Hmm.
your answers.
You want to highlight a few, and then we'll go a little bit more deeper.
Sure. So Rahul Kakkar said mistakes that look good.
Hmm.
Chetan said that's his take, that creativity is about doing things differently such that it's not predictable.
Mm. Interesting. Predictability as creativity. Okay. Surprise. This is also an interesting answer by Shreyas, which is how do you surprise yourself and others? I like this answer. This is something I'm going to go much deeper,
Yeah,
which is Natansh's answer. Mayank, you want to talk a little bit? I'm just going to quickly take this call.
sure. Is being creative being good at recognizing pre-existing patterns? Is being creative being good at recognizing pre-existing patterns? So I feel, so Natansh, this is my take to it, right? I feel if you're able to recognize pre-existing patterns, you're well experienced. Um, Creativity can come in knowing how you can be unique after that, but that does not, it doesn't start, being creative does not start can start from there, but I don't feel it is that, because when you're recognizing pre-existing pattern, it means that you've experienced and seen all of it. It means you lived through each time every part was being implemented, right? So by the time you've realized that this is a pattern, you've already spent like so much experience doing it that there is a good chance that you've also used your formative years or your just seeing everything and not actually being creative or trying to be unique. Because also something what happens is that what you feel is unique, something starts off as unique, and with time everyone starts implementing it, and then it becomes mainstream.
Mm. So what we're going to do is let's take a few more, and then we have a surprise for all of you. We have a very interesting surprise, so hold on till then. I want to talk about this idea of synthesis as well. The reason is because I see a lot of answers here, which is creating unique things, creating things that surprise you, doing things that haven't been done, doing things which are unpredictable, right? Something which has your unique perspective. I want to talk about this idea of creativity as synthesis, which is when you're creating something, where is that idea coming from? Let's think about that for a sec, which is it's definitely coming from your mind. You are thinking about something, but then what's behind that? A lot of times, creativity is not really coming up with something new, but is combining existing parts into something new.
True.
Which is, for example, if you think of you have a set of Legos, creativity, everybody still has the same pieces of Legos. You can, however, if you are really into it, get more Legos, which is you can actually go find really rare pieces that can help you. But you are putting things together based on what you have already, right? So a lot of times creativity might not always mean about coming up with something that's never been done before.
Yeah.
But it's about combining some of these elements that you have, some of these building blocks, and putting it together in a way that is not unique in the world, but unique in the sense of in this situation you would not maybe expect it. Or it's never been done in this way before. It has been done in other ways, but nobody thought it could be here. So this also then connects to the idea of recognizing patterns, which is if you can recognize that patterns exist, then you can actually draw insights from those patterns and mix things. Which is, let's try to take an example, Mayank. I think that would be much better.
So I actually have a kind of an example, which is that I was listening to an interview recently between Kunal and the founder of Gojek. And I don't know, I found it somewhere as a recommendation, but in that, the topic of the interview was dark secrets of being a founder. right? And in that, while they were talking about how do you come up with problems or how do you tell, they were discussing how do they tell folks if their idea is not good, right? So in that while they were talking about that, one line that stood out was that you don't necessarily have to come up with um, unique ideas. You can also come up with ideas that are better solutions than the existing solutions, right? For example, man, there are hundreds of music apps, right? But every time a new music app comes up which is a better solution to the previous one, it gets hype and it starts improving, right? So for example, this is what 10K, you can take 10K as an example itself, right?
Take Whiteboard as an
Or
example,
take,
right? This is something I wanted to talk about as well,
yeah,
which is let's talk about this show. We're in our 14th session right now. We've got more than 100 videos, close to 150 now on the YouTube. The question I have is this creative? Is this a creative thing to do? Right? That's my first question. Think about that. And then I want to sort of break down what makes this happen, which is there aren't any design live shows or YouTube channels where we interview people who are at the start of their career. That's how we started
yeah.
with, right? So that, for example, doesn't exist. If it does, it doesn't exist at scale yet. It might exist, but if nobody knows about it, it's equivalent to not existing. But this concept that we're doing right now is not new, which is Gary Vee, for example, has this thing called Tea with Gary, where he does a live show where he answers questions, which is similar to this, but then it's him applying it to his context, which is a totally different context. It's different type of questions, but then the pattern there that you've recognized, right? The idea that Natansh put here, which is being creative good at recognizing patterns that people might not have noticed. The pattern there is that people want to ask questions to Gary because he has a certain advantage, a certain unique perspective about how he does things. Similarly, and another pattern is live TV shows, which used to happen every Friday night. Right? That is something that we all grew up with. Today with content, most of it is on demand, where you go and you watch it. But then now you're overwhelmed because you have to make the choice.
Yeah.
So what we've done is we've combined some of these things. We've synthesized these into this Whiteboard Live, for example, which is not really unique, surprising. It might be to you, but the idea is we've taken certain elements, combined them in a new way, and that is creativity. So the formula that I want to give you for creativity, very ironic in some sense, because ideally there should not be a formula. But the idea is whenever you start learning something, let's say you start learning Photoshop or Figma, you can't immediately be creative at it because you are now trying to understand what makes things happen. So the formula for learning something new and eventually for creativity is first you observe something, right? Let's say you're trying to learn how to play the guitar or the piano.
Yeah.
First you listen to what somebody else has made. Then you try to recreate it. And in the process, like, let's say you're trying to play a song that's kind of popular on the guitar. And in the process, you try to figure out some of the chords. You sort of figure out how exactly they do it. Right? So now what you've done is you've taken this thing and you've broken down into some of its pieces. And now at this point, you still can't recreate properly, but with practice, you get there. Eventually, when you start combining these in a unique way, that is creativity. But you can't break these rules till you know what the rules are. So even with, let's say, the piano, there's a certain number of keys and that's about it. But there's an unlimited number of combinations. And not only is it, this is your set, but you can now bring in insights or inspiration from other fields. And all these other fields are sort of unique to you. Yeah.
So Abhinav, I have a question to this. You raise a really nice point, right? You mentioned constraints, right? So when do you feel you're most creative? With more constraints or less constraints?
I feel I'm more creative with more constraints. Here's the reason for that. When you're creating something new and you have an unlimited amount of time,
Yeah.
you're likely not going to create anything. Why? Because let me give you an example of if you've been given a big assignment, which is a 2 month, you've been given a 2 month time period to do
Yeah.
it. You might start on day one, you might start working on it on day one, but the pace that you'll be at is whatever.
Yeah.
You have an abundance of time, and that doesn't really force you to synthesize. It might get you into explore mode, but it doesn't get you into synthesis mode. So at this point, you're exploring. The reason most people do their final papers only in the last week of submission or the last night is because now a constraint is applied. Now suddenly there's an external environment that's putting you into focus mode, because all the things that are non-essential have automatically dropped out. One very common question I've gotten from cohort members is, when do you stop research? Right? It's a very similar pattern if you're observing here, which is, if you have an abundance of time, you're going to be like, let me do research. You're going to get into it and you're going to do as much research as possible. And research is something that's never enough, because you can keep going on and on and on, because you're trying to learn more and it feels productive to do as well. But then the minute you have deadlines, you're like, screw that, that's not essential. You're like, there's 11 chapters, I'm going to study only 5 because that's going to give me enough, right? The non-essential parts drop off. And that is when you get creative, I would say, because now you are not trying to explore, you're trying to exploit. And that means focus. That means narrowing down from all these different possibilities to a possibility.
Yeah.
Because at its end, creativity is bringing something into life, which is, you have certain ideas or concepts or a certain vision or a certain direction. Let's not even call it a vision. That sounds too grand. It's something that you want to make and you want to bring it out. The longer you stay in your head, the less likely that you will actually bring it out. Versus this focus of moving from explore to exploit means you finally bring it out. So constraints that way, I think, play a very interesting role. That's why I find hackathons really interesting, because something you could build that would take you a month to build, a lot of times people do it in 2 days. Why? Because they're forced to prioritize.
Yeah.
This external environment creates something within them where they say, this is essential. The question that they've been avoiding, which is, what do I not do? Or what is non-essential, gets decided for them in that moment. So that's how I think about constraints. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting, because I thought in a similar approach as well, but I never labeled it that way, right? So never considered synthesis always, because, so for example, one thing which I do is that if I don't feel motivated to do some work, I take up more work. Because then I feel motivated to do the previous work as well, because now I've got a lot of work to do which needs to be done. Yeah. But then at that time, I'm not considering the fact that I've got constraint of time now. I just consider that, oh, I have a lot more work to do, so I need to start completing things. So that's how things play for me. But then considering two things, constraints and synthesis, in this conversation, that brings more clarity to it. Yeah. Natansh mentioned, yeah.
Sure. And I think some people are asking about how can creativity be taught. Technically, creativity cannot be taught, but it can be learned. Which is, somebody else cannot teach you how to be creative, but they can create a certain environment in which you can learn to be creative.
Yeah.
Interesting here, because most of the time we assume people can directly teach you things. But what I'm saying is people can indirectly teach you creativity, but then you have to do it for yourself. Do you have any examples of that, Mayank?
Bro, so exactly. So for me, since we started Whiteboard, and from whatever period I've been working with you, right? Creativity for me has been increasing in 2 ways, right? So since I joined Cred and since I started working with you, I have 2 streams of creativity. I learned creativity from 2 sources. That is, I learned from my experience as a designer at Cred. I learned from my experience with working with you. There are two methodologies. For me, creativity is also kind of inhibiting the good things that I like about the people that I work with, in terms of their way towards work and the way they work and the approach and how they do it itself, right? So in terms of building a product, and like right now, whatever you mentioned in the beginning itself, right, that you're trying to automate things as well, I am imbibing all of that as well, which is why whenever we have our calls, I like picking your brain, which is why, like, so for all those, I don't think I've explicitly mentioned this to Abhinav as well, but whenever we have those late night or brainstorming sessions, my objective is brainstorming definitely, but also to pick your brain, because these are ways for me to learn and explore ways of being creative. So this is a way in which you can say creativity can't be taught, but it can be learned, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's very interesting because it can be learned, and the person can give you an environment where you're allowed to be creative, or there are, like, this idea of constraints as well. It's hard for you to give yourself constraints, because then it's like, oh, I know I have, let's say, a month to do this, but you can't force yourself to say, okay, I have to do it in this weekend, because there's no real deadline. You're manufacturing a fake deadline. So it's hard in some ways to create constraints for yourself, but other people can do that for you, which is, let's say, with this cohort, some of the assignments, it's not just about the assignment brief. You could have totally done this by yourself, but doing this where there are 30 or 40 people starting their assignments on the same day, the next couple of days you have mentor sessions where you're supposed to discuss, then in a week you're supposed to reach this point. There is this environment. Now, I'm not teaching you creativity through this, but you can learn creativity through this, but you still have to do that yourself. That's super interesting. Yeah.
Also, it's very little things like these, like, right, like you have to be observant as well. So for example, I'm pretty sure a lot of folks would have learned a lot from the videos that we did when we were designing the Whiteboard website, right? Just seeing the video and listening about the process and all of it would have given them new ideas that, hey, I can implement what these guys did in this part of the video in my own process as well. And another thing which you mentioned, I feel, last week as well, is in some conversation you had mentioned that lately, when there are times when you're making decisions as a founder, you think of what Gaurav did at an academy or what Gaurav would have done, right? So it's like we mentioned, right? It's not just about being unique, but using all the patterns that you have or that you've seen pre-existing and combining them in your way.
True. And I think a lot of people think of creativity as personal expression, right? Which is, they're sort of correlated, but it's not exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Right? Creativity is not really about personal expression where you are trying to, it's not a very egoistic thing where you as a person, you're like, I have these crazy experiences and now I'm going to do something. It's not really this artist persona that you see in movies, where there's one guy who's like a genius. He goes off into a certain thing, does a bunch of bad shit, but then eventually comes out with something that's amazing. Right? It's not always a personal journey. A lot of times creativity is a process towards an end.
Yeah.
Like problem solving, for example, you can do problem solving creatively, but then of course you can't, it's not as clear as labeling, like today I'm going to do problem solving creatively, tomorrow I'll do it non-creatively. But you are, whenever you're solving problems, you are pattern matching, which is, if today you are designing a certain type of flow, or you're designing something in your app, automatically you're going to think about the last time you designed a similar flow. And you'll think about how you saw that similar flow in another app that you were checking out. And then when you do this, you're going to combine that and put it here. So there is also this idea a lot of you might have heard about, which is everything is a remix. Have you heard about this? People in the chats, let me know. Everything is a remix. You can actually Google this phrase as well. There's a lot of interesting resources to explore around this. Is the idea there's actually nothing new under the sun. Every single thing that you see is a remix of a bunch of other things. And these things might not be obvious to you. So when something does surprise you, it's because you don't exactly know what it came from. But when you see something and you're able to appreciate, oh, that's how I see this, it's because you are able to understand, oh, this person has combined these 2 or these 3 or these 7 concepts. So a lot of times creativity is about remixing. What exactly do you remix? What exactly are your sources? That's where a personal perspective comes into play.
For sure, man. Yeah, remix, I feel it's also like a lot of us, when we see something new, we feel like, oh, damn, this is so cool, it's so creative. But what might be new to us might not be new to someone who's seen similar things beforehand. It's just that you have repackaged it and sold it and are branding it in a different way.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to go a little deeper on this concept of creativity. And for this, I want to surprise you guys with something new, right? Very sure none of you can guess this, but we have a guest joining us tonight. What's up, Sidharth?
What up? How's it going? Look at that new
Good, man.
T-shirt. I'm jealous. Oh, is that Zara thingy?
Similar.
Hey, I want that T-shirt, the one Mayank is wearing, the 10K Designers New Edition.
I'm gonna send this to you. I think I told you this in one of the previous streams as well, but then it slipped my mind. Okay.
I come and remind him on stream, folks. What's up? Rohan is there. Manish, Silvadas. Hello. How are you doing?
So Sidharth, we're talking about this concept today of creativity, which is what exactly is it? Can it be taught? Do you need it? And we want to hear your perspective. So when you think of creativity, or how your idea of creativity has changed over the years, what do you think of?
I used to always think, I think initial idea, I was always into art and this thing. So first, the idea of this thing was around creativity. You create something new, right? So it was that it was associated with that. Then I was like, then later on, I was like, you learn and realize that everything is a derivative. Nothing is really an original, right? So then you go like, no, it's more about finding pathways and connections that may have not existed before. And I watched a documentary and Discovery about how neurons work, and that made a lot of sense to me. That essentially you have this part of the brain which can think about number 2 and visualize it, and then you have these googly eyes, neuron, and if they talk to each other, suddenly you have number 2 with googly eyes, and that people will call like, oh, so creative, right? So I think that was my simplest formula early on. Now I think I associate a lot with just the aspect of like, another aspect that I learned about creativity was stress, right? Has two kind of stress. One is a unhealthy stress, typically what we mean by stress, where you have guilt or pressure or those things, and that is what we mean by unhealthy stress. And then, but if you add this sense of I want to know, right, along with it, then it becomes more of a, when you're curious, stress is useful. Like you like stress. Like if I'm curious about something and it becomes a little stressful, like if I'm really into a game, I really get into the game even more, right? Instead of getting like, let's give up. So that was another aspect of creativity that I've recently discovered. But the basic essence remains same. It's finding pathways that are new to you, but pathways can only exist in things that already exist. So the pathway is the creation, not that is why everything is derivative work. But the kind of derivation you do will be uniquely your own. And I think that is where it comes down to me. The idea of creation of new pathways that are fascinating to you.
Yeah, I've also explored this idea of creating new pathways from a nootropics perspective, which is There are actually a lot of mushrooms out there, not just magic mushrooms, that do promote the concept called neurogenesis. So it promotes the creation of new pathways, which is, you can think about it in this way for folks who are not familiar with neurogenesis, is you have parts of your brain that aren't properly connected, which is they don't communicate that often. But there are modes that you can get into with certain, let's just call them experiences, where new pathways are created and it throws you into a certain new state. So there are experiences that can happen. So Sidharth, what I want to ask you is, for somebody who wants to be very conscious about creative growth, which is they don't want this to be a random process where it's just happening and hopefully I get creative over time. They want to be very, very conscious. How do I actually improve my creativity day over day, week over week, month over month? What is something they can do?
I think people talk about, often about practicing the creative muscle, right? And keeping the juices flowing. I recently started playing online chess, right? And even though it's a logical, rational game, people often go okay, creative or rational side. You need creativity and rationality, like mathematical problem solving, scientific problem, all of these things, right? I'm leading this to somewhere now. The way after starting playing chess, now I remember I was standing on the floor. On my floor there are tiles, right? Now those patterns just light up, right? Like it's chess board everywhere, right? So I come back to this the same idea I was going by, curiosity and stress. If you want more, the way to get curiosity is to find what you're curious about and fuel it. And the way to fuel it is to stress yourself on it, right? So if you're curious about design, you will almost realize you almost overload yourself all the time, right? With the information, almost to the point where you're like, okay, can't do it anymore, then you stop, right? Some people will call it, oh, I get addicted, can I get other stuff, but which is, especially in creative things, addiction is curiosity. And right, so I think curiosity is the way to fuel your creativity, right? And that is why I mentioned that earlier as well, that curiosity and creativity for me are hinged together. You can't be curious, you can't be creative without being curious, right? So if you want to fuel that, find what you're curious about and try to be curious about. Like, let's say I say, okay, this is or Abhinav mentions neurogenesis, and if you today go back home and take his word for it, then you are not curious enough, right? If you go Google it, spend 5 minutes later on to figure out, okay, what was this actually about? Now it is more likely your mind will remember it, other things will happen, and the words start showing up, you start noticing it, and then that fuels more curiosity and more creativity. So for me, I think if you want to be more creative, learn to be curious first, and the way to be curious, finally coming to it, is exposure, right? The way you build taste, you build anything, the more ideas you expose yourself to, the more different kind of problem statements you expose yourself to, the more of these things you try, the more curious you become, and therefore more creative you become. Because again, the more exposure you have, remember you were talking about pathways, so you have more material to build those pathways, right? You need that raw material to build pathways, and curiosity is the willingness, but exposure is the raw material, right? So these three things have to play out. Set yourself to expose yourself to multiple ideas, different people. And then second, be curious about that. Will naturally make you curious because you'll find something interesting. And then third, you will start to find yourself creatively looking for a solution. I mean, how are we so creative in exams and how to cheat? All elements are there, right? The exposure is there. You've been exposed to all these ideas, and you have intent, strong intent, and curiosity, curiosity to can I do this? Can I pull this off? There's an intent there as well, and then you follow through with it, and then you realize, hey, there are creative ways. There are new pathways that the teacher has not yet figured out of how you can do cheating in examinations. So that's my favorite example, because that's the most creative space I've seen, which most people in their life have gone through. Like even people who will be like, oh, I'm not creative, will find such amazing creative ideas on how to cheat the system. So I think, that is one way to.
Yeah. And this is very interesting that you've mentioned this, because what I'm actually connecting this to is, even when we train machine learning models, right? When you're training a machine learning model to do something, which is, let me take a very simple example for people here. When you're on Amazon and it gives you recommended products, typically it's not just recommending based on popularity. There's a machine learning model which is trying to be creative about what it's recommending to you. And if it's a good match for you based on all this data that it has, it will be a good fit for the company because now they can make more money from this. When you're training these models to do a certain thing, number one thing you have to do is build a training set.
Oh.
So you need to build this training data that it can find patterns between and it can do things by itself. So it's very interesting that we've been able to actually codify creativity and this idea of repeated exposure to systems as well. Yeah,
That is indeed interesting, and in fact, machine learning and our the idea behind is virtual neural networks, and it literally mimics the way our neurons work. There's a very interesting, I think, video by Vsauce on getting a field of football, just general people in a football field, and make them act as a neuron. So all they do is just raise flags or not. He tells the number to this first row. One person, and he just tells them what to decide the number, tells what first row will do. They, based on their decision, will tell the second row, and eventually the other person what they get is the actual number that he thought of, right? So you realize, wow, I never said the number. All I did was just send signaling, and it just lights up, right? But we digress. Coming there, like how would I mean, if you look at science, right? We talk about birth of science. And many people may not look at science as creative thinking, but the fact science or the idea science brings out may be factual in nature, but the way we reach there are very creative, right? So if you look at how did science even start? The first early humans looking up to the sky and wondering what happens in the heavens and why things change and why things light up and make patterns and find things, right? But why would you do that if there was no sense of this, intent, curiosity, and why would you be so creative about it? Like, you're getting the point. Like, another example that just came to my mind, like, that's the birth of science, right? Then you start to have astrology, then astronomy finally arrives with, like, people going like, okay, it's not about stars affecting it this way, but Earth is not the center of the universe, and Galileo gets hanged and all that does happen. But yeah, we see renaissances happening from there onwards, but it was essentially that same element, right? Yeah. So, but another element is to how to use creativity, right? Is what I want to know. Like, because you can be very creative, but we often talk about how creative people are the worst at managing time, prioritizing stuff, which is debatable. I earlier held that opinion as well, but I just realized creative people are lazy. That is why they are creative. It's counterintuitive, but think about it. You were lazy enough not to study. So you were creative. It's much easier for you to be creative in examination, how to cheat, than to actually do the hard work of like studying, right? I think some famous CEO of some company said, I would rather hire a lazy programmer any day because they're going to find a system that doesn't break so that doesn't bother them. If you're hardworking, you don't mind like a failure-driven system, right? So but what are you lazy about is also important, right? So this is the only way to fuel creativity is to be lazy maybe in what you go after, but don't be lazy about curiosity. Like be lazy about guilt, be lazy about jealousy, be lazy about all those other emotions, right? But curiosity is a feeling, not rather emotion, that I think should be very proactive about. Like, if there's a day that you don't feel curious, maybe that day needs reconsideration. On another aspect on using creativity is not to overwhelm yourself, because you realize creativity happens at a certain level of stress, right? Where you're seeking a question. Imagine like you drop your phone behind like a crack, like really thin crack. Now you will like bend, twist, think, move. Like your entire physical, mental senses are involved in creatively solving this problem, taking this pursuit, right? But if it was to drop beyond your reach, right, and go away, now that stress is too high for any now it becomes devastation. So that sweet spot is a personal thing, and the more you go into that zone, the more you realize where the stress is too much. And usually when the stress feels a little overwhelming and you start getting good at it, you start to feel good, that's the time to increase stress. People linger on, right? Oh, I'm feeling good, I learned this, but that causes Dunning-Kruger effect to kick in, right? You start to believe you know everything, and but before ever that kicks in, what you're gonna do is stress yourself even more with new information. I don't know if I'm making sense. I'm talking this abstracts. I can switch to chess idea, but the moment I learned about, let's say, basic opening patterns, I was like, what are the basic defense patterns? Even though I don't understand the opening patterns completely, and now that I understand opening patterns, but time to move to like, what are the end game things you should look at? What are the different kind of players? What are their moves? How do you think? Like, always have something that you don't understand. That is the only way to constantly stay curious. If you know everything, that if there's ever a moment you have not expanded that circle, you will fall into the fallacy, oh, I know shit. So, the other thing starts to kick in.
And I think this ties into the idea of constraints that we were talking about earlier. Because I feel like when you have an abundance of time,
right,
you can actually be creative, but you can't be creatively productive.
Yeah, then you're creative in your head, in daydreaming. That's not really creativity.
The ideal state you want to get to is you're productively creative, right? And I think that really comes...
Creation is an important part of creativity. Let's put it that way. If you haven't created, it's not creative.
True. Creativity does require things to come outside your head into the real world, in some form, through a certain process.
Right.
If it's still in your head, it might just be the seeds of creativity, but it's not creativity yet, because nothing has been created.
Right.
Right.
Correct. So you can't go also creative if you have not created anything. Oh, I am very creative in my head. Good. Then what you have created is an imagination. What you're creating there is imagination, right? And imagination and creativity are related. You use imagination as one of the tools to be creative, like you use mathematics as one of the tools to be creative. For example, I use when you're drawing patterns in design, right? If you divide that squares and patterning, you're using geometry, logical, mathematical driven geometry, Euclidean geometry, to do creative work, right? So creativity is not this irrational blah blah this thing, and it's not the same thing as imagination, right? You can be your people say now your imagination is not that creative, so it's possible to have imagination but not a great one, so not a very creative one. You can't imagine too far.
Where do you think is the trap of ego here? Which is what do you think ego does to your imagination or creativity, or to the process of creation?
That's a very, I think, most logical step. What we're talking about, the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? So we talk about, if you know this much, right, then the periphery is what you don't know, right? The outside circle. Now, so when you learn little, what you don't know, what you know you don't know is also little. As you learn more, that area circumference of what you don't know also increases. That is why experts believe they don't know anything, right? That is why their answer is, I think so. Most likely, in the best case scenario, instead of yes, no. Like, you will never hear yes, no, like, ever. And that is why, like, scientists also will mass help in most cases, right? They will not say yes, mass will help, because they can't give that sort of answer, because science and these kind of things teaches you the level of uncertainty that you live in, right? The very limitations of your own thinking, right? So what ego stands to do, or where even ego stands from, is to think that what this area of circumference is, this is it, right? When all evidence exists otherwise. There will always be more books than you can read, more knowledge that you can have, more expertise than you can ever have. So no single human being, at least in modern day and time, can ever say their circle is done. Like, they know everything there is to be known, right? So if you go like, that is ego, like saying I know. If you say I know, then you have limited the growth, right? Then your creativity is also stopped, because the new material that you build connection between is fast running out, right? That is when we call people like one trick pony, or these kind of things come from, because you just learn that one trick in that one circle, and you keep doing that. You are master of that, but it only has that much in it. But you never expose yourself to anything more. You never. And if you look at musicians, etc., and you look at their story, the artists, they always have this initial phase of exploring, right? In poetry and painting, and especially in painting, I used to study painting in college. They used to say the real paintings come out only after 30s, because life has washed you enough to actually have an experience. Before that, what you're what you're drawing, like, what you're painting, like, focus on realism, focus on something like that. Yeah. Like, the real juice and material will come out when you lived enough life to have emotions, right? So that is where if you stop exposure, the moment that you bring in ego, you stop exposure, which is they are fundamentally related to each other, because ego means that you believe you don't need exposure, right? That is what the definition of ego is, that you don't need to know anything more. So then it starts to limit that circle's growth, and that means your creativity is now on a decline. In a sense, you will have less and less new material to play with because you are not adding anything new, right? It's like stopping to stock the kitchen, saying I have everything ever I need in life, and don't like build a wall where my door is. I don't need anybody to come in and go out. That's ego, right? Like, sure, it's hardcore, badass, but like, the fuck are you doing to yourself, right?
Yeah, for sure. Siddharth,
Humko दीवार में चुनवा दिया.
super interesting conversation. I'm already seeing the chat. Chat is going crazy over the conversation.
Yeah, I saw many things. Just read about today itself that laziness is deep rooted in humans, and we tend to prefer roads that require minimum. Correct. Like, have you seen anyone reaching out for mobile phone when it's ringing and it's like the amount of bend twisting, like you become a gymnast, like when you have to pick up a phone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Siddharth, we're nearing the end of this conversation. Anything from the chat that you think is interesting that you want to talk a little bit more about? Beyond that, we'll do a part 2 next week where we can go a little deeper into some of these, let me call it the esoteric concepts around design.
Ooh. You're a special audience, folks. Only you understand this.
Anything from the chat that stands out to you?
Yes. Okay. Let's look at why are we not talking about micro dosing already? Oh geez. That's another level. LSD has entered the chat. Arik, where has LSD entered the chat?
I think we'll have to do a separate ABNUX 2 live stream for that.
Psychedelics. Yeah. Psychedelic music experiences and cultural subculture.
Yeah.
It has interesting connotation on design as well, because Steve Jobs comes from the psychedelic era of.
Dude, this is a concept we can have an entire complete live stream. The same, because I've even looked a lot into how the birth of Silicon Valley technically does come from psychedelics.
Oh.
What kind of implication that has. So there's like books about this.
Right.
Anybody's interested, there's a book around this called What the Dormouse Said.
Right.
Dormouse. And it basically talks about how from World War II, how that led into the whole era of hippies, where people were like, hey, this is what we want to do. This is a new lifestyle that we want to create for ourselves.
Right.
And how the kids of that generation said, we have to create tools to help us do this.
Right.
And that was the rise of personal computers.
Right.
So, yes, that is
an interesting thing you bring up, because if you look at iPad Pro launch with Apple Pencil 2, I still remember the marketing Apple used is we create tools for you to create art, the work of your lifetime, right? And that sort of messaging, something along those lines. And that for me, after years, felt like original Apple, like a creators, a pros tools, and it feels like one. Like I think you've been using an iPad and pencil as well, right?
Yeah.
Like it feels like what I would expect a pro tool to feel like, right? And if you look at all our careers, right, many of us, most guitarists who are serious about being a guitarist will create their own guitar eventually, or have a person who does that. Indian instruments are tuned to particular person. Like Ravi Shankar got sitar modified and it's called Ravi Shankar style sitar. And there's now Anushka Shankar style sitar where Anushka Shankar got it modified for herself, right? And in Indian instruments and Indian art, we carry that. Like harmoniums are tuned to particular male and female voices, within which you can get it further tuned to your voice, softness, loudness, and all those things. Tablas are like that. For like, this is for ghazal tabla, this is for classical tabla, because their resonance are different. So you start to realize that I don't even know where I was going with this, but all in all, you need to you create your own tools in a profession, and you realize that they are standard tools like Figma, but within Figma you have your own systems and processes and frameworks, which are your tools of the trade. How you organize a file, how you do iterations, how you copy paste things, right? These are your standard patterns of pieces and moves in a chess that you've created. Sorry, I'm obsessed with chess. These are and I literally told someone I can't move all the pawns at once. I'm not even kidding. But yeah, that is how I look at it. And that is also creative process, right? How do you know which tool you need, or how do you want to modify a sitar or guitar if you've not played it enough, right? If you've not been in the arena enough. So speaking of tools and creating tools and creators tools, as a creator, you will invariably create your tools, new tools that don't exist. Another on creativity and creators I want to leave on just last note was creativity is such a process that births two aspects. Okay, for example, when childbirth happens, right, a child and a mother both come into existence. I think child existed and it is would be mother and would be child before that, right? Same way when a painter creates the painting, right? The act of painting creates a painting, but the act of painting also creates the artist or the painter of that painting, right? So philosophically speaking, creativity is an interesting junction where the canvas and the artist, right? And while all processes are like that, but this when we talk about creativity, it's hyper energized, right? The way doing a painting changes you versus doing jhadu.
For sure, man. For sure. I want to point this is something that I remind myself often. This right here.
Yeah. First we shave the tools, then they shave. Oh, right. Oh, it's right there. It's right there.
This is sort of like the inverse of what we're talking about.
Right,
which is
right.
you realize the effect your tools have on you.
Right. You start to modify them.
Make my own tools.
Right.
To change myself.
Right. Because it's profound because imagine if you buy for example, let's say you do music, right? And you do singing and you have a keyboard or in classical music, you match your voice to harmoniums, right? But if you buy the wrong harmonium, you will never actually hear the beauty of your voice ever. You just won't hear it because you all along your reference material, your tool was the wrong tool of the choice. So it has shaped you in a way which has limited your creativity because you never, yeah. Sidharth is saying, ditch your ego and approach everything as a beginner. That's the problem. It's so hard to do. It's easy to say, right? In fact, what is to say that you feel like you're going like a beginner, but that's not Dunning-Kruger effect itself. Going like, hey, I know how to be like a beginner. Maybe you don't, right?
Yeah. Cool, Sidharth. This has been a great session. Let's do part 2 next Thursday.
Write part 2 in chat if you want a part 2. Write part 2 in chat right away. I want it, so I'm writing it.
Yes, for sure. And what we're going to do is we're going to go a little bit deeper into some of these things we've talked about. And I want you all to think a little bit about the things we've discussed today. Come with really interesting curveball of questions, which is, it should be difficult. And then, of course, we'll do a much bigger session where we'll talk about all of this stuff. That's about it.
Part 2 is happening. All right, folks. All right, we're going to do it.
Okay. See you all then. Good night.
Take care, folks. Good night.